The moment Rosa Turner walked into Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882, the town had already decided what kind of woman she was. She came in on the back of a freight wagon, her dress faded to a dusty rose that had once been a deep and proud red, her dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. She had $2.30 in the pocket of her skirt, a small carpetbag clutched against her chest, and a past that had followed her 600 miles from a town in Missouri called Harrow's Bend, where people had whispered her name the way they whispered about drought and disease, with a grim satisfaction, as if her suffering somehow confirmed something they had always suspected about the world. In Harrow's Bend, Rosa Turner had been engaged to a man named Gerald Holt. Gerald was the son of the town's wealthiest banker, a man who wore fine waistcoats and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had practiced sounding educated. Gerald had courted Rosa for 2 years, and she had believed, the way a young woman believes when she has been given little reason to believe in much else, that he was honest and that his love was real. She had been 22 years old and foolish only in the way that trusting someone made you foolish, which was to say she had been guilty of nothing except hope. Gerald had taken liberties he had no right to take. He had done so with the whispered promise of marriage, with the assurance that the ceremony was a formality they were already past in every way that mattered, and Rosa had believed him because he said it with such confidence, and because she had loved him, and because she had been 22 years old, and the world had not yet shown her the full breadth of its cruelty. When she discovered she was with child, Gerald's confidence evaporated as cleanly as morning dew. He denied everything. His father backed him with the weight of money and social standing. The child had come early and had not survived, and Rosa had buried her grief along with the tiny, perfect boy who had lived only 3 days, and she had thought that was the worst of it. But in Harrow's Bend, the worst came after. The town decided that what had happened to Rosa was her own doing. She had been reckless, they said. She had thrown herself at Gerald Holt. She had tried to trap a good man. She was ruined, they said, and they said it with the certainty of people who had appointed themselves the judges of other people's worth without ever examining their own. Rosa had stood in the general store one Tuesday morning and heard Mrs. Beaumont say to the seamstress loud enough to carry, "That Turner girl is ruined, completely ruined. Not a respectable soul would have anything to do with her now." And Mrs. Beaumont had said it the way you say a thing when you want the person to hear it, when the saying of it is itself the punishment. Rosa had not wept in public. She had finished her shopping, walked home, packed what she could carry, and left before sunrise the following morning. She had walked to the edge of town, where the freight wagon stopped, and she had offered the driver her last $5 to take her as far west as he was going. He had gone as far as Caldwell, and so that was where she arrived, on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, stepping down from the wagon into the dust of a cattle town that smelled of manure and wood smoke, and faintly, on the right wind, of the open prairie beyond. Caldwell was a border town, sitting right on the edge of Indian Territory, a place where cattle drives ended, and where men who had been on the trail for months came looking for a hot meal, a cold drink, and whatever else they could find. It was loud and rough and indifferent to most things, but Rosa would discover quickly that it was not indifferent to a woman traveling alone with a carpetbag and a faded dress. She found work at the Blue Star boarding house, run by a woman named Mee Whitfield, who was broad-shouldered and direct in the way that only women who had survived real hardship tended to be. Mee hired Rosa to help with the cooking and the cleaning in exchange for room and board and a small weekly wage, and she did so without asking too many questions, which Rosa appreciated more than she could say. The Blue Star housed a rotating collection of travelers, cattle drivers, land agents, gamblers, men passing through on their way to somewhere else. It was honest work, and Rosa did it without complaint. She woke before the sun to start the bread, cooked 3 meals a day, cleaned the rooms, laundered the sheets, and fell into bed each night so tired that she rarely had energy to feel sorry for herself, which was perhaps the greatest mercy of honest labor. But Caldwell had its own Mrs. Beaumonts. There was a woman named Patricia Stiles who ran the millinery shop on Main Street, and who considered herself the moral authority of the town, with the same cheerful conviction with which she considered her bonnets the finest available between Wichita and the Territory. Patricia Stiles had a network of acquaintances and a talent for the pointed observation, and within 2 weeks of Rosa's arrival, the story had been assembled and distributed. Rosa Turner had come from Harrow's Bend. There had been a scandal. She was, in the estimation of Patricia Stiles and the small circle of women who orbited her like satellites around a disapproving sun, ruined. Rosa heard it again for the first time on a Friday afternoon in May, standing in the dry goods store, when a woman she had never met looked at her with that particular expression, that mix of pity and contempt that was somehow worse than contempt alone, and said to her companion in a voice just loud enough, "She's the Turner woman from Missouri. They say she's ruined." Rosa bought her flour and her salt and walked back to the Blue Star and stood in the kitchen for a long moment with her hands flat on the worktable, steadying herself. She was 23 years old. She had buried a child and left everything she knew and traveled 600 miles, and she was standing in a kitchen in Kansas making bread for strangers. And still the word followed her like a crow follows a plow, opportunistic and relentless. Mee Whitfield found her there. Mee was not a woman given to softness, but she had a directness that Rosa had come to appreciate as its own kind of warmth. Mee poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of Rosa and said, "You heard it, didn't you?" Rosa said, "Yes." Mee said, "Patricia Stiles wouldn't know ruined if it sat across the table from her and introduced itself. She's never had to start anything, never had to leave anything, never had to rebuild. People like that, they think surviving is the same as failing." She drank her coffee. "You're not ruined, you're just not finished yet." Rosa appreciated me saying it, but the word still settled in her chest like a stone, and she carried it with her through the rest of May and into June, when Oscar Walker rode into Caldwell. Oscar Walker came in from the south, off the Kisham Trail, at the end of a cattle drive that had taken 3 months and covered nearly 500 miles from Texas. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with the careful, quiet manner of a man who had spent long stretches in open country and had gotten used to measuring his words the way you measure water in dry land. You did not waste it, and you did not take it for granted. He had dark brown eyes and a jaw that carried a week's worth of trail dust and stubble, and he moved through the world with a particular kind of attention, the way a man moves when he has learned to read weather and terrain and the small shifts that precede large events. He had been raised in Tennessee, had moved west at 19 after his father's farm was lost to debt, and had spent the better part of a decade doing the work. The frontier required cattle driving, fence work, brief spells as a ranch hand, one season of work on the railroad that he did not like to talk about because the conditions had been appalling, and the pay had been insulting, and he had seen things done to men that he could not entirely square with the country's claims about itself. He had come eventually to the cattle trail because it paid reasonably, and it suited his nature, which was independent and patient and more comfortable with sky than with walls. He came to the Blue Star because Mee Whitfield set a good table, and because he had stayed there twice before on previous drives, and found it the most honest establishment in Caldwell, which was not saying a great deal about Caldwell, but was saying a great deal about the Blue Star. Rosa was serving supper when he arrived. She brought the platter of beans and salt pork to the long table in the dining room and set it down and looked up and found him watching her, not the way some of the men watched her, with the presumptuous appraisal that assumed a woman working in a boarding house was available for acquisition, but with a quiet, careful attention, like a man who was trying to understand something and was taking his time about it. She said, "I'll get the bread," and went back to the kitchen. He ate without causing trouble, which in Caldwell was its own distinction. He thanked her when she refilled his coffee. He said please and meant it. He did not speak a great deal, but what he said was direct and unadorned, and he had the quality, rare in Rosa's experience, of listening when someone else spoke, actually listening, not merely waiting for his turn. After supper he sat on the front porch in the long June evening, and Rosa came out to sweep the boards, and he said, "Smells like rain coming." She looked at the sky, which was the deep orange and purple of a prairie sunset, entirely cloudless. She said, "There is not a cloud in sight." He said, "Give it until morning. There's a smell to the air, not a bad rain, just a steady one." She swept the boards and said nothing, and by morning it was raining steady and warm, the kind of rain that settled the dust and made the whole prairie smell green and alive. And Rosa stood at the kitchen window watching it fall and thought that was a useful kind of person to be, someone who could read what was coming before it arrived. He stayed 4 days. He needed to rest his horse. He needed to draw his pay from the cattle broker on Main Street. And he needed, she suspected, the uncomplicated comfort of a regular bed and regular meals before deciding what came next. He ate his meals at the Blue Star, said his please and thank you, spent his afternoons down at the stable with his horse, and in the evening sat on the porch and read, which surprised her. A trail hand who carried a book was not what she expected. On the second evening she was sweeping the porch again, and he was reading, and she could not quite help herself. She said, "What are you reading?" He held it up. It was a copy of 2 Years Before the Mast by Richard Henry Dana. "Have you read it?" he asked. She said no. She had read very little, had been schooled in a one-room schoolhouse in Missouri until she was 14, and had found books wherever she could manage since then, but she had not read that one. He said, "It's about a man who goes to sea, ends up on the California coast. He writes about the land there, about the way it looks from the water, and sometimes I think about going out that way, California, just to see if what he describes is true." Rosa said, "And if it is?" He said, "Then I suppose I'd stay a while." She swept the last of the boards and straightened up and looked at him and said, "That sounds like a good way to live, going somewhere to see if the description is true." He looked at her with those quiet dark eyes and said, "Yes, though I've found descriptions are always either more or less than the real thing, never exactly right. The real thing always surprises you." She thought about that and went inside and lay in her narrow bed above the kitchen, listening to the night sounds of Caldwell, the distant noise of the saloons, and the closer sound of the horse in the stable shifting in its stall. And she thought about a man who went somewhere just to see if the description was true. On the third day he was sitting at breakfast when Patricia Stiles came in with her friend Harriet Morse to speak with me about some civic function they were planning. And Patricia Stiles saw Rosa carrying the coffee pot and said to Harriet, loudly enough to perform for the dining room, "I do wish me would be more careful about her hirings. That Turner woman is known to be quite thoroughly ruined. It reflects on the establishment." The dining room went quiet, with the particular uncomfortable quiet of people who have heard something cruel and are deciding whether to pretend they haven't. Rosa set the coffee pot down on the sideboard with great care and kept her face arranged. She had learned this, the arrangement of the face. You took what hit you and you kept your face arranged so that they could not see the impact, because letting them see the impact was giving them what they wanted. Oscar Walker set down his fork. He looked at Patricia Stiles for a long moment with the careful, steady attention he seemed to turn on everything. Then he said, in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely clear, "Ruined is a word for people who have never had to start over. It doesn't apply to someone doing honest work in an honest establishment." The quiet in the room shifted. Patricia Stiles turned her attention to him with the expression of a woman who had not expected resistance from that direction. She said, "I beg your pardon," he said. "I don't think you need my pardon, ma'am. I think you know what I said." He picked up his fork and resumed eating. He did not add anything further. He did not look at Rosa, which she understood as its own kind of grace to say the thing and then not make her perform gratitude for it, not turn it into a scene she had to participate in. Patricia Stiles drew herself up and said something to Harriet Morse in a low, clipped voice, and the two of them went to find me in the back. And the dining room breathed again, and Rosa went to refill the coffee cups with her hands entirely steady, which took more effort than it looked. Later, when the breakfast rush was done and the room was empty, she found him settling his bill with me at the front desk. He was leaving, she realized. His 4 days were up. His horse was rested and his pay was drawn. She said, "What you said this morning." He turned and looked at her. She said, "You did not have to say that." He said, "I know." She said, "Why did you?" He considered this with the same unhurried care he seemed to bring to every question, the way a man considers the horizon before he rides toward it. Then he said, "Because it was true. And because true things don't always say themselves when they need to be said. Sometimes someone has to say them." She looked at him and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the sensation of being seen without being judged, of someone looking in her direction and finding not a cautionary tale but a person. She said, "Where are you heading?" He said, "West, I think. Maybe New Mexico territory, maybe further. I've been thinking about trying something different. Ranch work, maybe." "Somewhere I can put down a stake," she said. "Good luck to you then," he said. "And to you, Miss Turner." He put on his hat, nodded to me, and walked out. She watched him go to the stable, watched him bring his horse out, a bay with a white star on its forehead, watched him ride south out of Caldwell into the wide, flat morning, and then she went back to the kitchen and started the noon meal. She thought about what he had said. Ruined is a word for people who have never had to start over. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn a stone to find the better face of it. She had been called ruined by people who had built nothing, risked nothing, lost nothing. People who had stood in the same safe place their whole lives and watched others fall, and named the falling with their comfortable, unearned certainty. The people in Harrow's Bend had never had to start over. Patricia Stiles had never had to start over. They threw the word like a stone from a safe distance, and the stone was all the more injurious because they themselves had never been struck by one. She was not ruined. She had started over. There was a difference, a great and significant difference, and she was going to hold onto that difference the way you hold onto a rope over water. June gave way to July. The summer heat settled on Caldwell like a flat iron on cotton, relentless and pressing. The cattle drives came and went, and the Blue Star stayed full, and Rosa worked her long days and saved her small wages and thought, in the quiet hours between the dinner clearing and the breakfast preparations, about what starting over might look like when she could choose its shape for herself. She had saved $14. It was not much. But it was hers, every cent of it, and it felt different from any money she had handled before, different from her father's wages, and different from the housekeeping allowance Gerald Holt had sometimes pressed into her hand. It felt earned and it felt clean, and when she counted it she felt something that she recognized eventually as dignity. Me sat with her one evening in mid-July, the two of them on the back porch with the slight relief of the night breeze, and me said, "You've been here 3 months. Rosa said, "Yes." Me said, "You're good at this work. You could stay as long as you like, but I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honest." She paused. "What do you actually want, Rosa? Not what you need right now." "What do you want?" Rosa thought about it. She said, "I want land. I want something that's mine. I want to grow things." She thought about the garden her mother had kept in Missouri, the tomatoes and the herbs, the pea vines climbing the fence. "I want somewhere that doesn't already have a story about me. Somewhere I can be a person before they decide what kind of person I am." Me nodded like a woman receiving information she had already suspected. She said, "There's a homestead parcel available about 12 miles south, near the territory line. The family that had it moved back east in March. The land agent has been trying to place it. It's not much, 160 acres, dry, with a soddy on it that needs work, but the land is solid and there's a creek that hasn't run dry in 2 years according to the neighbors. With the Homestead Act you could file a claim on it if you're a widow or single woman head of household. The fee's $14. Rosa looked at me for a long moment. Me said, "I'm not pushing you anywhere. I'm just telling you what's available." Rosa said, "I have exactly $14. Me smiled. It was a real smile, rare and warm, and she said, "Well, that seems like a conversation worth having with the land agent." Rosa filed the claim on the 2nd of August, 1882. She signed her name, Rosa Ellen Turner, in the land agent's ledger, paid her $14, and received a folded paper document that said, in the official language of the General Land Office, that she had claim to 160 acres in Sumner County, Kansas. She walked out of the land office with that paper in her hands and stood in the August heat on the main street of Caldwell and felt the ground under her feet as though for the first time felt it as something real and particular, soil that had a specific quality, that held a specific history, that would from this point forward include her. She gave me proper notice and spent the rest of August learning everything she could about the land, about dry farming in Kansas, about what a woman alone could manage and what she would need help with. Me knew everyone worth knowing and introduced Rosa to her neighbors, the Delacroix family 3 miles east, and the old Norwegian farmer named Halvorsen, who had been working that stretch of prairie for 6 years, and knew its rhythms the way you know the rhythms of something you have survived alongside. She moved onto the land in September. The soddy was a low, practical structure, walls cut from the prairie sod itself, thick and cool in summer and warm in winter, smelling of earth and dry grass. It was small and dim and entirely hers. She repaired the roof with help from Halvorsen's 2 eldest sons, rechinked the gaps in the walls, installed a proper iron stove that me helped her acquire secondhand from a departing household. She planted a fall garden late as it was, got a few things in the ground before the first frost: garlic, winter greens, root vegetables, and spent her evenings planning for spring with the focused attention of someone who has found, perhaps for the first time, a use for the future. She was lonely sometimes. Loneliness on the prairie had a particular quality, expansive and clean, unlike the loneliness she had felt in Harrow's Bend, which had been cramped and watched. Out here, the loneliness was just space, just the honest fact of being one person in a large world, and she found she could bear it, even find something in it that was close to peace. She thought about Oscar Walker sometimes. She thought about the way he had spoken without making it a performance, the way he had said a true thing and then simply gotten on with his breakfast. She thought about California and descriptions that were never exactly right, and the real thing always surprising you. She thought these were the thoughts of a woman who was lonely, and she was honest with herself about that, but she thought them anyway. October came, and with it the first real cold and the satisfying hard labor of preparing for winter. Rosa had arranged with me to sell eggs and butter through the boarding house, which gave her a small steady income, and she had her garden and her 2 chickens and her 1 borrowed mule, and she was, by any honest measure, managing. It was the 2nd week of October when the bay horse with the white star on its forehead appeared at the edge of her land. She was outside splitting wood when she saw him come down the trail from the north, and she stood with the axe in her hand and watched him ride toward her with the particular quality of attention she had come to associate with Oscar Walker, that unhurried, observant progression through the world. He stopped at the fence, which was really just a line of posts she had put in but not yet strung with wire. He said, "Miss Turner," she said, "Mr. Walker." He took in the soddy and the garden and the woodpile and the general evidence of human habitation assembled from will and necessity, and something in his face shifted in a way she could not entirely read. He said, "Me Whitfield told me you'd filed a claim," she said. "She told you where to find me," he said. I asked, "I hope that's not presumptuous." She set the axe down. She said, "I thought you were going to New Mexico Territory." He said, "I went. I looked at it." He paused. "It didn't need me. This country does." She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Get down off that horse then if you're staying to talk." He got down. He tied the bay to one of her fence posts, and she put the axe away and went inside and made coffee, and he sat in the 1 chair she had while she sat on the edge of the cot, and they drank coffee and talked. He had gone south into New Mexico Territory, he said, had spent 2 months there looking at the land and the work and the possibilities, and had found it beautiful, but had found also that it lacked something he couldn't name precisely, some quality of rightness, some sense of fit between himself and the place. He had come back north into Kansas and had stopped at the Blue Star, and Whitfield had said Rosa Turner was 12 miles south with a homestead claim and was managing but could probably use a good hand for the winter work. Rosa said, "Me said that," he said, "more or less." She looked at her coffee. She said, "What kind of arrangement are you proposing, Mr. Walker?" He said, "Honest work for fair wages if you have them, or room and board if you don't. I can build, I can farm, I can winter a place. I don't have anywhere particular to be, and I'm useful to have around." He paused. "That's all I'm proposing, useful work, no other expectations." She looked at him and said, "You rode 200 miles to offer me fair wages or room and board," he said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I rode 200 miles because I've been thinking about what you asked me and I didn't answer well." She said, "What did I ask?" He said, "You asked me why I said what I said to that woman in the dining room. I said it was because true things needed saying." "That's true, but it's not the whole truth." He turned his hat in his hands. "The whole truth is that I've seen a lot of country and I've met a lot of people, and I have not often met a person who struck me as both honest and brave, and you did. And I made a poor decision riding west when I wanted to ride back." The soddy was quiet. Outside, the wind was coming off the prairie with the first real edge of October cold in it, and the sound of it against the sod walls was a low, steady whisper. Rosa said, "You should know that this land is mine and I intend it to stay mine." He said, "Of course," she said, "and you should know what they say about me." He said, "I know what they say." "I don't think it's relevant to anything I've told you," she said. "Most people think it's relevant to everything." He said, "Then most people are wrong." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not proposing anything improper, Miss Turner. I'm saying I'd like to stay near enough to know how you get on. If you'll permit it, I'll find work nearby and be a neighbor. If you need help, I'll help. If you'd rather I keep my distance, I'll keep it." She thought about what it meant to be lonely on the prairie versus what it meant to be lonely in a town full of people who had decided your story for you. She thought about $14 and 160 acres, and a woman who was not finished yet. She said, "There's a lean-to on the east side that needs a proper wall before winter comes. If you can do that, I'll feed you while you do it." He said, "That's a fair trade." He stayed in the lean-to while he worked on it, sleeping on a bedroll, eating at her table, rising before dawn the way a man does when he has a task to attend to. He built the lean-to wall in 4 days, and then found other things that needed doing. The fence needed wire strung. The shed where she kept the mule needed a new roof section. The windmill that stood dry on the north side of the property needed its mechanism cleaned and adjusted. He worked with the steady, capable application of a man who had spent a decade doing physical labor and had made his peace with it. They talked at meals and in the evenings when the work was done and the day was closing down. They talked about everything, about his childhood in Tennessee, about the mountains there and the small creek-fed farm his father had worked, about the years on the trail and what the land looked like from the back of a horse over long distances, about the railroad work he had done and the things he had seen there, the men who worked for almost nothing in conditions that he described with a careful, contained anger that Rosa recognized as the anger of someone who thought injustice mattered and had not made peace with the portions of it he'd witnessed. He talked about the Indian Territory just south of them, about the Kiowa and Comanche and the great displacement that had been carried out in the name of settlement, and he spoke of it without the breezy dismissal she heard from most men, spoke of it as what it was, a wrong done to people for the benefit of other people, dressed up in the language of progress. Rosa appreciated that. She had grown up in Missouri where these things were spoken of as distant and impersonal, and she had come to believe that you learned a great deal about a person by whether they were able to acknowledge injustice when it did not directly affect them. She talked too, more than she had talked to anyone in years. She told him about her mother, who had died when Rosa was 15, a quiet, determined woman who had kept her garden with an almost religious devotion, and had told Rosa that the ground never lied to you. It gave back what you put in it, and nothing extra and nothing less. She told him about her father, who had been a decent man undone by grief, who had drunk steadily after her mother's death and dwindled away and died when Rosa was 19, leaving her to the indifferent mercy of a community that was not particularly merciful. She told him about Harrow's Bend and Gerald Holt with a plain, steady voice, the way you tell a thing when you have decided it will not have power over you. She did not make it dramatic. She said what had happened, and she said how it had ended, and she said she had left, and she said she was here now, and that was what mattered. He listened to all of it. He did not offer opinions on what she should have done differently or what the men involved had been thinking. When she was done, he said, "You did the right thing leaving." She said, "I know," he said, "and the people who called you ruined were protecting themselves." She said, "How do you mean?" He said, "If they could call you ruined, they didn't have to think about why you were in that situation. They didn't have to think about what kind of town allows a man like Gerald Holt to do what he did without consequence. They didn't have to think about whether their own sons or husbands had done similar things. Naming you ruined was easier than examining what was actually rotten." He paused. "They built the word around you so they didn't have to look at what they'd failed to build themselves." Rosa sat with that for a long moment. She said, "Me Whitfield said something like that." He said, "Me Whitfield is a sensible woman." She said, "She is." She looked at her hands, which were rough now from the work of the land, the nails short and practical, the palms calloused in ways that Harrow's Bend Rosa would not have recognized. She said, "I think sometimes about the boy who didn't live." He did not rush to fill that silence. He let it be what it was. She said, "He was so small. He had 10 fingers and 10 toes, and he had my mother's nose, I thought. He lived 3 days." She breathed. "I put him in the ground in Harrow's Bend, and then I had to leave him there when I left. That's the part that sits heaviest. That he's there and I'm here, and the town that killed him in all the ways a town can kill someone is still right there next to where he's buried." Oscar Walker said, quietly, "He's in the ground wherever that is, but you carry him with you. That doesn't change by geography." She looked at him across the table and felt the particular sting of tears that she had learned in the past 2 years to address efficiently and without drama. She pressed them back. She said, "That's a good way to think about it." He said, "It's how I think about my father. He's in Tennessee. I'm in Kansas, but I carry him." They sat in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had said honest things and did not need to fill the space after them with noise. November came, and with it Oscar had found work at the Delacroix Ranch 3 miles east, helping with the winter cattle management, and he came back to Rosa's homestead most evenings, stopping in, helping with whatever needed doing in the last hour of daylight. It had become a pattern so natural that neither of them remarked on it. He was simply there, the way a person can become simply there when they are the right fit for the space. She was aware that she was falling in love with him. She was aware of it with the clear-eyed honesty she tried to bring to all difficult things, aware of it as both a delight and a concern, aware that the last time she had loved a man it had cost her more than she could afford to lose. She examined her feelings with the careful skepticism of someone who had been hurt and was no longer interested in ignoring warning signs. But there were no warning signs. That was the thing. Oscar Walker said what he meant and meant what he said, and when he was wrong about something, and he was sometimes wrong, he was human and had the human tendency toward occasional wrongness. He said so without making it complicated. He did not perform. He did not calculate. He was, as far as she could tell in 4 months of careful observation, simply the man he appeared to be, and the man he appeared to be was good. She was aware also that he was falling in love with her, because she was observant and he was not as opaque as he perhaps believed himself to be. She saw it in the way he turned toward her when she spoke, the way his attention collected and focused when she entered a room, The way he held his words, sometimes just a beat longer than necessary, as though reluctant to end a conversation. She saw it, and she held it carefully and did not rush it, because they were both people who had learned to be careful with things that mattered. It was a December evening, cold and clear, the Kansas stars brilliant and vast above the flat land, when Oscar walked her back from the Delacroix family's house where they had both been invited for supper. They walked the 3 miles through the cold and talked about the supper and about the Delacroix children, who were loud and numerous and charming, and about the spring planting and what Rosa was planning for the south field. Their breath made clouds in the air. The frozen ground crunched under their boots. The moon was a sharp sliver above the western horizon. At her gate, the gate he had built, proper wood with a working latch, he stopped and she stopped, and they looked at each other in the moonlight, and the space between them was the kind of space that asks to be reduced. He said, "Rosa." It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded different in his voice than it had ever sounded before. Not the name a town used to categorize her, not the name on a land claim document, but something closer to its original intention, which was just herself, just the particular human fact of her. She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to tell you something, and I want to do it honestly, without any expectation attached to it, because I think honesty between us is more important than getting any particular answer." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I love you. I have loved you since the spring, I think, since the morning it rained and you said there wasn't a cloud in sight, or maybe since before that. I'm not certain of the starting point. I am certain of the fact." He paused. "I'm not saying it to change anything or to pressure anything. I'm saying it because it's true, and I am better at the truth than at staying quiet when the truth matters." Rosa Turner stood in the December cold of the Kansas prairie with the moon above her and the frozen ground under her boots and the gate of her own land behind her, and she felt the stone that had lived in her chest since Harrow's Bend, the stone named Ruined, the stone named Not Enough, the stone named Sorry for Hoping. She felt it come loose and fall away into the frozen ground and disappear. She said, "I love you too. I have been aware of it for some time, and I have been examining it thoroughly to make sure it was real and not just loneliness or gratitude." He said, "And," she said, "it's real. It's entirely real. It has nothing to do with loneliness or gratitude, though I feel those things too. It is separate from them and larger than them." He took a step toward her, and she took a step toward him, and he put his hand against her face, careful and warm against the cold air, and she leaned into it the way you lean into warmth when you have been cold for a long time, and he kissed her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, unhurried and entirely present, and the prairie was vast and cold and brilliant around them, and she thought that she had not known it was possible to feel this much of something good. He pulled back and looked at her and said, "We should get you inside before you freeze." She laughed, which surprised her. She had not laughed, really laughed with her whole self, in longer than she could easily remember. She said, "You are a very practical man, Oscar Walker." He said, "I have found that practical and romantic are not mutually exclusive. The practical thing and the right thing are often the same thing." She went inside, and he went home to his room at the Delacroix bunkhouse, and she lay in her narrow bed in the soddy with the iron stove glowing and the wind whispering against the sod walls, and she felt, for the first time since her mother had died, that she was in the right place. Not just geographically. In the right place in the larger sense, the sense of being in the right portion of her own life, the portion she was supposed to be in, the portion where what happened next could be good. Christmas came, and they spent it at Me Whitfield's invitation back in Caldwell, at the Blue Star, where Me put on a proper Christmas dinner for the boarders and the few people who had become something like family. Me sat at the head of the table and looked at Rosa and Oscar with the expression of a woman whose matchmaking, however indirect, had come to satisfying fruition. Rosa caught Me's eye, and Me raised her coffee cup, and that was all that needed to be said. Patricia Stiles was not at the dinner, which was not a surprise. Patricia Stiles would not have come to Me Whitfield's table under any circumstances. but Rosa passed her on Main Street on Christmas Eve, coming out of the millinery shop, and Patricia Stiles looked at her with the habitual expression of assessment, the expression that said she was calculating how to categorize. And Rosa looked back at her with the clear, unhurried gaze of a woman who had 160 acres of Kansas land in her name and love in her heart, and absolutely no need for anyone else's categorization. And Patricia Stiles, confronted with that gaze, found somewhere else to direct her eyes. Rosa did not feel triumph exactly. She felt something quieter, the absence of fear. The fear that other people's words could reach her and diminish her. She had been afraid of that for so long, had carried it so automatically, that its absence felt strange and new and deeply, wholly good. January was hard. January on the prairie was always hard. The cold was not the cold of towns, which was mitigated by walls and neighbors and the muffled proximity of other lives. The cold of the open land was absolute and democratic, giving itself without preference to every surface and corner, and Rosa kept the stove burning and wore everything she owned and was glad for every cord of wood Oscar had split in the fall. He came every day. He came through the worst of the cold, through 2 January blizzards that turned the world white and featureless, and she met him at the door with coffee, and they sat by the stove and talked, and sometimes played cards, and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence with the blizzard howling outside and the stove ticking in the warmth. It was a different kind of life than anything she had known, not the life she had grown up in, not the life Harrow's Bend had implied she should want, not anything she had imagined. Better than any of them, harder and better and more hers. It was in January, during the second blizzard, sitting by the stove with a deck of cards between them and the wind pressing against the walls, that he said, "I want to marry you, Rosa." She set down her cards. He said, "Not as a means of changing anything. The land is yours and stays yours. I have no interest in claiming what you've built. I want to marry you because I want to be your husband, and I want to build something with you, and I want to stop being at the Delacroix bunkhouse when I could be here." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about marriage the way she had understood it before, which was as a transaction and a transfer, as the mechanism by which a woman became the legal property of a man. She thought about how that structure had always frightened her. She thought about Oscar Walker, who had ridden 200 miles because he'd given an incomplete answer to a question, who had said that the land was hers and would stay hers, who had never once made her feel like a problem to be managed or a deficit to be accounted for. She said, "You understand that I will not be a woman who disappears into her marriage." He said, "I don't want you to disappear. I want you exactly as you are." She said, "And you understand that I've been hurt and I will be careful and I will need you to be patient with that." He said, "Rosa, I would wait however long you needed. I'm just letting you know where I stand." She said, "I know where you stand. I've known for some time." She took a breath of the warm stove-heated air and said, "Yes, I'll marry you, Oscar Walker." He reached across the cards and took her hand, and outside the blizzard pressed and howled against the walls of the place she had built, and inside was warm and certain and completely, exactly right. They married in March of 1883 in the Caldwell church, in a ceremony that was small and plain and entirely true. Me Whitfield stood for Rosa. Halvorsen, the old Norwegian farmer, stood for Oscar. The preacher was a young man named Reverend Cole, who had come to Caldwell the previous fall, and who performed the ceremony with genuine feeling and without excessive speechifying, which Oscar later said was the mark of a wise man. Rosa wore a dress she had made herself through the winter months, a deep blue wool with white buttons, the best garment she had ever owned, made by her own hands and paid for with her own money. She had her mother's small garnet earrings, which she had carried in the bottom of her carpet-bag across 600 miles of her life, and which were the only things she had of her mother beyond memory. She wore them and felt her mother present in the small church in Kansas, felt her approving in the way that her mother had always approved of honest things done bravely. Oscar wore a clean shirt and his good boots, and the look of a man in the exact right place at the exact right moment. He held her hands when they made their vows and held them steadily and looked at her face when he said the words. And when the Reverend said they were married and he kissed her, she heard Mee Whitfield make a small, warm sound that was the closest Mee Whitfield ever came to crying. After the ceremony, they ate a wedding dinner at the Blue Star. Mee had done more than Rosa had asked her to, had laid a proper table with the good cloth and had made a cake. A real cake with white sugar frosting that was an extravagance so obvious and generous that Rosa hugged her and Mee bore it with gruff, clearly touched dignity. Rosa Walker stood in the Blue Star dining room on her wedding day and thought about the morning she had arrived in Caldwell with $2.30 and a carpet bag, and the word ruined following her like weather. She thought about me saying, "You're not ruined, you're not finished yet." She thought about Oscar saying ruined is a word for people who have never started over. She thought about the land claim paper with her name on it, about the soddy she had repaired and the garden she had planted, and the wall and the linta that Oscar had built, and the long winter evenings by the stove and the December night at the gate when he had kissed her in the moonlight. She thought about what she had become in the space of a year and what she had always been, which were more related than she had previously understood. She had always been a woman who could build something. She had just needed ground to build it on. They rode home to the claim that evening, the two of them on horseback in the March cold, the stars enormous above the flat land. And when they came to the gate, Oscar got down and opened it for her in a gesture that was not gallantry for its own sake, but the practical courtesy of a man who opened gates because gates needed opening. And she rode through onto her land with her husband beside her, and she felt the rightness of it so completely that there were no adequate words for it, which was fine, because she was learning that the best things rarely required words. Spring came in earnest in April, and they planted together, Rosa directing the plan she had laid out through the winter, the south field in wheat, the kitchen garden expanded now with 2 pairs of hands to work it, a small corn plot near the creek. Oscar turned out to have the skill of his Tennessee farmer father in him, the ability to read soil and slope and drainage with a practical instinct that complemented Rosa's own learning beautifully. They disagreed sometimes about the planting decisions in the way that 2 competent people disagree, directly and specifically, and they reached agreements, and occasionally one of them was wrong and acknowledged it, and they moved on, which was in Rosa's experience a revolutionary way to conduct a disagreement. Oscar brought in an additional income from the Delacroix Ranch, where he continued to work part-time through the spring, and with 2 incomes and the careful management that Rosa had practiced through her first year of homesteading, they began to accumulate the means to improve the property properly. By summer, they had started construction on a real house to stand beside the soddy timber-framed, proper lumber hauled out from Caldwell, 2 rooms to begin with and room to add more. They worked on the house together through the summer, Rosa doing the work she could do, the plastering, the floor laying, the 1,000 detail tasks, and Oscar doing the heavy framing and roofing with help from the Delacroix brothers, who came on Saturdays with their tools and their noise and their enormous appetite for whatever Rosa put on the table, which she provided gladly because they worked well and asked for nothing except the food. By September, the house had 2 rooms and a proper roof, and a real plank floor and glass windows, and Rosa stood in the front doorway and looked out at her land, her wheat field harvested and clean, her kitchen garden going into its winter sleep, her creek still running in the late dry season, her fence properly strung now with wire, her gate and her soddy and the linta where Oscar had first slept. And she felt the full and particular satisfaction of a person who has built something from nothing and who knows, with absolute certainty, what it cost and what it means. Mee Whitfield came out in October for a visit which involved me sitting in Rosa's new kitchen with a cup of coffee and examining the house with the proprietary pride of someone who felt they had a hand in its existence, which in a very real sense she did. Mee said, "Your mother would be pleased." Rosa said, I believe she would. Me said, and you, are you pleased? Rosa said, I am the most pleased I have ever been, me, by a significant measure. Me nodded. She said, good. She drank her coffee. She said, Oscar suits you. Rosa said, he does. Me said, I knew it when I saw him come into the boarding house asking which direction you'd gone. A man who asks that kind of question with that particular expression on his face has already decided something, whether he knows it or not. Rosa smiled. She said, you sent him to me. Me said, I pointed him in the direction he was already going, that's all. She set down her cup. You did the rest. That winter was gentler than the one before it. Or perhaps it only seemed so because they were in the real house with its better insulation, and its 2 stoves, and its proper windows that kept the wind outside where it belonged. They spent the long evenings reading and talking, and planning the expansion of the spring planting, and making the house more a home, adding the small things that transform a structure into a life, curtains that Rosa sewed from a remnant of printed cotton, a shelf that Oscar built for the books they were accumulating, a braided rug that Rosa worked through January, a watercolor painting of the Tennessee mountains that Oscar bought at great expense from a traveling painter who passed through Caldwell in November, and that Oscar hung over the mantel because he said he wanted something of his childhood home in the house. Rosa hung beside it a small charcoal sketch she had done of the prairie in winter, the flat white land and the vast sky above it, simple and true. Oscar said it was better than the painting. She said it wasn't, but she was glad he thought so. She realized she was with child again in February. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Oscar, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she needed to hold it herself first, needed to examine it without anyone else's feelings in the room. She thought about the boy she had buried in Harrow's Bend, thought about him with the steady, ongoing grief that does not diminish so much as it becomes habitual, becomes the specific weight you carry and learn the shape of. She thought about what it meant to be with child in this different life, in this house on this land with this man. She told him on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen. She said, I'm going to have a child. He set down the coffee pot very carefully. He turned and looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as the most complete human feeling she had ever seen on a face. Not just happiness, though that was there, but something older and more complex. The expression of someone receiving something they had wanted with such care they hadn't quite let themselves want it. He said, Are you all right? She said, Yes. I'm careful about what I allow myself to feel until I know the child is safe and present. But yes, I'm all right. He said, Tell me what you need, she said. I need exactly what I have, which is this house and this land and you. And I need you to not treat me like I'm made of glass. He said, You have never looked remotely like glass to me. She said, Good. He came and stood beside her and put his arm around her, and they stood in their kitchen in the February light and looked out at the winter prairie, and he said, very quietly, I am very glad, Rosa. She said, So am I. The spring planting that year had a different quality to it, undertaken with the particular awareness of new life in multiple senses. The seeds going into the ground and Rosa's body doing its own work of growing. She worked through the spring with the measured care of someone who respects what they are carrying, stopping when she needed to stop, asking for help when she needed it, which was not her natural inclination but which she was learning. Oscar hired a boy from the Delacroix farm, a 16-year-old named Philip, to do the heavier field work through the summer, and Halvorson's wife Ingrid, a small and tremendously capable Norwegian woman, came twice a week to help with the larger household tasks, and in this way the homestead ran through Rosa's pregnancy with a kind of organized grace. Their son was born on the 22nd of September, 1884, in the bedroom of the real house, delivered by the Caldwell doctor who had ridden out when Oscar went for him in the gray pre-dawn. He was a large, loud, healthy boy, and he announced his arrival with the unambiguous authority of someone who intended to be heard. Rosa held him in the September morning light, and felt the grief of the boy she had lost transmute into something that was not its replacement, but its continuation, not forgetting but honoring, the living carrying forward what the dead left behind. Oscar sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby with the same expression he'd had in the kitchen in February, that complete human feeling, and said, "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like a person who has opinions about being born." Oscar laughed, and the baby turned his face toward the sound, and Rosa thought that was perhaps the most perfect moment she had ever experienced in her life on Earth. They named him James Henry Walker James for Oscar's father, Henry for Rosa's, and he was from the very beginning exactly the child he appeared to be, which was large and curious and determined, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's broad-shouldered frame already evident in miniature. Mee Whitfield came out to meet him and held him with the careful expertise of a woman who had held many babies and said, "He's got good bones." This was Mee's highest compliment, and Rosa understood it as such. Life on the Walker homestead in the years that followed was the life that Rosa had planned in the soddy on those early winter evenings, except larger and louder, and more than she had imagined. The farm grew as they grew more land under cultivation, more animals, a proper barn that Oscar and the Delacroix brothers raised in a single long August day, with half the county helping and Rosa and Ingrid Halvorsen feeding everyone from tables set up in the yard. They acquired a milk cow and then 2 more. They built a proper chicken coop. They expanded the house to 4 rooms when James was 2 years old and a second child was coming. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1887, small and bright-eyed, and they named her Clara after Rosa's mother's given name, Clara Mee Walker, the Mee for the woman who had looked at a ruined girl arriving in Caldwell with $2.30 and had seen instead a person who wasn't finished yet. Mee was visibly and uncharacteristically moved when Rosa told her the name, and she looked away and found something extremely interesting to examine in the blue stars dining room ceiling, and Rosa let her have the moment. James was a tremendous older brother, large and careful with Clara in the way that physically capable children can be with smaller ones when they have been raised to understand that size carries responsibility. He followed Oscar around the farm with devoted attention, absorbing everything, and he followed Rosa around the kitchen and the garden with equal devotion, which pleased her enormously. A boy who learned to cook and garden and sew a button was a boy who would be capable in the world regardless of what the world required of him. Clara was her own distinct person from very early, quieter than her brother, more observant, with a quality of stillness that occasionally made you check whether she was actually listening, and then discover that she had memorized everything you'd said. She had Rosa's mother's nose, which Rosa noticed one morning when Clara was 3, and felt the old grief and the new love meeting in her chest, the small and permanent presence of those who were gone carried forward in the faces of those who arrived. The Caldwell community had shifted around Rosa in the years since her arrival. Some of the shifting was the natural shifting of any community. People left, people died, new people came and were not carrying the old stories. Harriet Morse, Patricia Stiles' friend, had come to Rosa one afternoon in 1884 when Harriet's young daughter had fallen ill and the doctor was unavailable, and Rosa had sat with the child through the fever and helped bring it down, and Harriet had looked at her across the cot where her daughter slept in recovery and said, "I owe you an apology. I said things I should not have said and I believed things I should not have believed." Rosa had looked at her and said, "Your daughter is going to be fine. That is what matters today." It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was the decision that carrying resentment against Harriet Morse required more of Rosa's energy than Harriet Morse had earned. People followed the loudest voice in the room, and the loudest voice in the room in 1882 had been Patricia Stiles. Rosa had more interesting things to do with her life than maintain a grievance against an echo. Patricia Stiles herself had left Caldwell in 1885 when her husband relocated to Denver for business, and Rosa had felt her departure as the departure of weather. You noticed it was gone and appreciated the change and did not think about it further. What Rosa did think about, and thought about with increasing clarity as the years passed, and the farm grew, and her children grew, and her marriage deepened in the way that good things deepen with time and use, was what it meant to have started over. She thought about it on the mornings when she stood in the kitchen window watching the light come up over the wheat field. 4 times the size it had been in 1882, golden in the September mornings, their labor made visible and permanent in the grain. She thought about it when she watched Oscar and James at the fence line, Oscar pointing at something in the sky and James shading his eyes to look. The two of them having whatever conversation men and their sons have about birds and weather and the shape of the land. She thought about Mrs. Beaumont in Harrow's Bend saying that Turner girl is ruined, and she thought about Patricia Stiles saying she wishes me would be more careful about her hirings, and she thought about the weight of those words, the real weight they had carried, how they had pressed on her chest like stones in the months she had carried them. She thought about them, and she thought about Oscar saying ruined is a word for people who have never had to start over, and she thought about me saying you're not ruined, you're not finished yet, and she thought that the people who had called her ruined had been describing themselves, the limits of their own imaginations, the poverty of their own vision, the smallness of a world in which a woman's worth could be unmade by the actions of a dishonest man. She had started over. She had started from $2.30 and a carpetbag and a word that was supposed to define her, and she had built something real, land and house and harvest and family, and a life that was, by any honest measure, a good one. Not ruined. Started. Oscar found her at the kitchen window one September morning in 1888, the year James was 4 and Clara was almost 2, standing in the light watching the wheat. He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, the familiar and exact comfort of someone who fits against you, and he said, "What are you thinking about?" she said. "About the difference between being ruined and starting over." He said, "Still thinking about that," she said. "Sometimes, less than before, but sometimes." She turned in his arms and looked at his face, which was weathered now, the years of outdoor work visible in the lines around his eyes, in the slight deepening of the creases around his mouth, and she thought he was more himself than he had ever been, more settled in the shape of who he was, and she felt toward him the specific love that is not the bright, nervous love of beginning but the deep, sure love of continuance, of someone who has proven themselves true in every season. She said, "Every time I think about it, I reach the same conclusion." He said, "Which is?" She said, "That I am glad it happened. Not the parts that were cruel, not the parts that hurt. But I am glad that the road went the way it did, because the road went through Caldwell in the spring of 1882, and through the Blue Star boarding house, and through a dining room where a man said a true thing and then finished his breakfast." He smiled. She had told him this before, and he received it each time without false modesty, with the simple honesty of someone who understood that you could matter to a person without taking credit for their life. He said, "I'm glad you stepped off that wagon," she said. "You weren't even there." He said, "I know. But I'm glad it happened, the whole sequence of it. The way the creek from a high mountain goes down through whatever country it goes through before it finds the river." He paused. "I spent a year and a half thinking I'd made a mistake, riding west when you were here. I don't intend to make another mistake like that." She said, "You came back." He said, "I came back." She said, "That's the whole of it, really. You came back and I was still here." He said, "You will always be here. This land is yours and this is where you are." She said, "And you?" He said, "I am wherever you are. That has not been complicated since December of 1882, and it will not become complicated." She laughed and kissed him, and outside the September morning was golden and enormous over the wheat field, over the fence and the barn and the chicken coop and the well and the gate, over the Walker homestead in Sumner County, Kansas, over the 160 acres of ground that had been dry and difficult, and had given back, faithfully and without deception, everything that was put into it. James Walker would in fact be followed by a third child in 1890, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived in the world with none of his brother's noise and all of his sister's quiet attention, and who became, in time, the bookish one, the one who took Oscar's old copy of 2 Years Before the Mast from the shelf when he was 9 years old and read it in 4 days and came to Rosa at breakfast and said, "Mother, I want to go to California." Rosa said, "When you are grown and it is your choice to make, you may go anywhere." Thomas said, "Did you always know that?" She said, "I learned it. I learned it the way you learn most important things, which is by doing the opposite and discovering how it felt." He looked at her with Clara's stillness and Oscar's patience combined and said, "Did it feel bad?" She said, "It felt like being a person who was waiting to be given permission to live her own life. And when I stopped waiting, everything changed." Thomas considered this with great seriousness for a 9-year-old and said, "I'll remember that." She said, "You do that." James grew into exactly the man you would expect of a boy who had 2 parents who believed in honest work, an honest speech broad and capable and direct, with a talent for the land that announced itself early and grew with him. By the time he was 12, he was running the wheat field with a practical competence that impressed even old Havorson, who had seen many farmers come and go, and was not given to easy impressions. Clara grew into a young woman of such quiet authority that she occasionally reminded Rosa of me Whitfield, which was the highest compliment Rosa had in her. Clara read everything she could lay hands on and wanted, when she was older and the family had more means, to go east to study, and Rosa and Oscar looked at each other and said yes, when the time comes and the means allow. Yes, because a world that told women what they could not be was a world that had cost Rosa enough already, and she had no intention of being that world to her own daughter. Me Whitfield died in the winter of 1893, peacefully, in her own bed at the Blue Star at the age of 67. Rosa was there when it happened. She had come to Caldwell when Me's health began to fail in November, had stayed at the Blue Star through December, cooking and sitting with me in the evenings, and Me had looked at her in those last weeks with the satisfaction of a woman surveying work she had done well. Me said once, "You turned out exactly right, Rosa." Rosa said, "I had help." Me said, "You had yourself. That was the main ingredient." Rosa held Me's hand and was quiet, and outside the winter Caldwell streets went about their business. And inside the Blue Star boarding house, the woman who had first told Rosa she was not ruined, moved peacefully out of the world in the early morning hours of a January day in 1893. And Rosa sat beside her, and was grateful with her whole heart for the specific mercy of having been seen clearly at the exact moment when she most needed it. She wept on the ride home through the winter cold, properly and fully and without the careful arrangement of the face, because some things are worth weeping for, and Me was one of them, and Oscar rode beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right, because some things do not need commentary. When they reached the gate of the Walker homestead, he got down and opened it for her the way he always did, practical courtesy unchanged by 12 years of marriage, and she rode through into her land, and the grief was real, and the love was real, and both of them were hers. The Blue Star came to Rosa and Me's will, which no one had expected, and which Rosa stood in the land office with Oscar beside her and read twice, very carefully, to make sure she had understood. Me had left the boarding house to Rosa with a note in the will that read, in Me's direct and unadorned handwriting, "You were the only one I trusted to keep it honest." Rosa kept it honest. She hired a manager to run the day-to-day operations and went in once a week and kept the books and made the decisions. And the Blue Star under her ownership was what Me had always made it clean and fair and welcoming to people who deserved a welcome, and occasionally, when it was necessary, direct with people who did not behave themselves. It brought in a reliable income that went into the farm and into the children's future, and into the small but real fund that would, in time, Allow Clara to go east. Oscar stood in the kitchen on a November evening in 1895, James 14, Clara 11, Thomas 9 watching Rosa at the table doing the Blue Star's accounts and said, "Do you remember what you had in your pocket when you got off that freight wagon in Caldwell?" she said without looking up. $2.30. He said, "And now?" She looked up. She looked at him standing in the kitchen of the house they had built in the home they had made, and she said, "Now I have everything worth having." He said, "Yes, though the wheat field also performed well this year." She threw her pencil at him and he caught it and she laughed in that sound. Rosa Walker's full, real, unguarded laugh went out through the glass windows of the real house and was lost in the large Kansas night, in the vast prairie dark, in the country they had both come to through hard and various roads, and it was good. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because years that are genuinely lived are never without difficulty. A bad drought year in 1896 that hit the wheat hard and required the careful management of reserves and a lean winter. A broken leg that Oscar sustained in the spring of 1897 from a horse that shied badly, and that healed cleanly but slowly. One terrible week when Thomas, at age 11, ran a fever that frightened them both profoundly before it broke. Life on the frontier in the last years of the 19th century was not soft. It was demanding and physical and required constant vigilance and capacity for adaptation. But it was theirs. Every difficulty was theirs to face, and they faced it the way they had learned to face everything, together and directly, without drama that was not warranted, and without minimizing what was real. They were good at this. They had been good at it since the beginning, since the way they had talked in the soddy over coffee about real things, since the way he had told her the truth in December on the gate and she had told it back. James left for his own homestead claim at 22, 2 miles west, which felt close enough to be a neighbor and far enough to be his own man, which was exactly as it should be. Rosa and Oscar helped him raise his first house the way the Delacroix brothers had helped them, and stood back and watched him put his first wheat in the ground, and felt the particular proud ache of parents watching their children begin. Clara went east at 18, to a women's academy in Massachusetts that Rosa had corresponded with for 2 years, and that agreed to admit Clara on the strength of a written examination that Clara passed with a score that surprised even Clara. Oscar put her on the eastbound train in Wichita on a September morning in 1905, and Rosa held her and said, "Write me everything." Clara said, "Mother, I know, I'll write every week." Rosa said, "Write more than that." Clara laughed and got on the train, and Rosa stood on the platform and watched the train until it was a point on the horizon and then gone, and Oscar stood beside her with his hand over hers on the platform rail, and the grief of her child going was real, and the pride was real, and she let them both be real because she had learned long ago that the right response to big feelings was to feel them rather than arrange your face against them. Thomas, the bookish one, did go to California at 20. He wrote long letters about the land, about the way the coast looked from the hills above it, about the quality of light that was different from Kansas light in ways that were hard to describe. He said the description in the book had been partly right and partly wrong, the way descriptions always were, but that the real thing was worth seeing. Rosa read his letters aloud to Oscar in the evenings, and they talked about the places Thomas described, and Oscar said, every so often, that they should go out and see for themselves someday. They did, in fact, go. In the autumn of 1910, Oscar and Rosa Walker, married 27 years, both of them on the far side of 50 and in full possession of their health and their curiosity, put James in charge of the Walker farm, locked the real house that had become over the years a very comfortable and genuinely beautiful home, and took the train west to California to visit their youngest son and see whether the descriptions in the book were true. They stood on the California coast on an October afternoon, the Pacific vast and gray-green before them, and Rosa Turner Walker, who had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas in 1882 with $2.30, and the word ruined following her like weather, stood in the Pacific wind and looked at more water than she had ever seen in her life, and felt the full and extraordinary fact of her own existence. Oscar stood beside her and put his arm around her, and they looked at the ocean together, and he said, "Well, what do you think?" She thought about the Saudi. She thought about the December night at the gate. She thought about me Whitfield's coffee and the bread she had made in the dark before sunrise and the $2.30, and the first time she had held James, and the first time she had seen the wheat field she had planted come up green in the spring. She thought about the word ruined and what it had cost her, and what it had failed to take, and what she had built in the space where it had lived. She said, "I think descriptions are always either more or less than the real thing." He looked at her and she looked at him. She said, "You told me that, a long time ago on the porch of the Blue Star." He said, "I did," she said. "You were right. The real thing always surprises you." She looked back at the ocean, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "This is bigger than any description, but so is everything that matters." He held her in the Pacific wind and she leaned into him, the familiar and exact fit of 27 years, the specific warmth of a person who had chosen her and stayed and built beside her. And the ocean moved the way oceans move, ancient and ongoing, caring nothing for the small human figures on the shore, and yet somehow, in its vastness, making the small figures feel not diminished, but enlarged by the evidence that the world was large, and that they had moved through a portion of it and had done so honestly and with love. They went back to Kansas in November, back to the real house and the wheat field and the gate that still had a working latch, and they picked up their life where they had left it and carried it forward in the way of people who carry their life as something they have made and value and intend to keep. Rosa sat at the kitchen table on their first evening home, the lamp warm against the November dark outside the windows, and wrote letters to James down the road, to Clara in Massachusetts where she had made a life as a teacher, to Thomas in California where he worked for a newspaper writing about the land. She wrote in her clear, direct handwriting, and she wrote the things that mattered, what they had seen, what they had thought, that the ocean was larger than any description, that the family was well and the farm was well, and she loved them and was glad of the specific way the road had gone. Oscar came in from checking the livestock and stamped the mud from his boots and came into the kitchen and stood at the stove warming his hands. And Rosa looked up from her letters and looked at him standing there in the lamplight, 56 years old and exactly himself, and felt the love she felt for him as the most real and substantial thing she owned, more real than the land and more substantial than the house. The thing that had no deed but needed none because it was written in everything they had done together, in every seed planted and every wall raised and every winter weathered and every morning come through to its other side. She said, "Come and sit with me." He sat beside her and she took his hand, and they sat at their kitchen table in the lamplight on a November evening in 1910 in Kansas. 28 years from the morning she had stepped off a freight wagon into Caldwell with $2.30 and a name someone else had tried to ruin, and the world outside was large and cold, and the world inside was warm and entirely, permanently, irreversibly theirs. She was not ruined. She had never been ruined. She had been brave and human and wronged, and she had started over, and she had built, and she had loved, and she had been loved in return, and the ground under their house had given back, faithfully and without deception, everything that was put into it. The lamp burned. The stove ticked its warm arithmetic. Oscar Walker held his wife's hand, and outside the Kansas night was vast and full of stars, the same stars that had been there when she rode into Caldwell, the same stars that had watched her sign her name to a homestead claim, the same stars that had been brilliant above the gate in December of 1882 when two people told each other the truth and changed everything. They were permanent, the stars, and so was this, the hand in hers, the lamplight, The life they had made word by honest word and acre by earned acre. The life that had been called ruined by people who had never built anything, and had become, in spite of them and because of itself, something true and lasting and entirely worth the cost of its beginning.